On this Pentecost Sunday, we read all of the traditional lessons for the day. In particular, we always focus on that biblical text from the second chapter of Acts, the one where the Holy Spirit comes and rests upon the disciples, and they begin to speak in all sorts of interesting languages. This lesson is usually the bane of many lectors as we listen to the long litany of cities and places, many of which no longer even exist, except they exist in our biblical record, and they are difficult for us to pronounce. And so we expect on this day to kind of look at things in this traditional way. Disciples speaking in strange languages, the Holy Spirit resting like small flames on their head. The other lesson that is frequently appointed for this day is in the Gospel of John. We've already read this story in previous times. It's the story where the disciples are locked in the room and Jesus appears among them. He comes and he says, "Peace be with you." And then we are told he breathes on them. And as Jesus breathes on his followers, he says, "Receive the Holy Spirit." In the Jewish tradition, there is only one word for wind and spirit and breath. We obviously have different words in our English language, and even in Greek we have some different words, but in Hebrew it's always the same word. We can't distinguish between breath and wind and spirit. And biblically speaking, breath means life. And then there's this week. There's this week when we see the newscasts of a young black man in Minnesota where his lack of breath meant death. We live in a time of the COVID virus where breath is potentially harmful. And so how is it that we hold all of this together? Where breath, that thing that means life, biblically can also mean danger to us, or could cause our own smothering. How do we make sense of that after we have been sitting at home for weeks? Truth be told, we want this mess to end. We are sick to death of distancing and masks and sanitizers. We want to be rescued from all of that stuff. That's the world, that's the moment in history in which we live. But when we look at the Pentecost story, I want you to, for a moment, just lay aside this language business and speaking in strange languages. And I want you to focus on what was going on in the lives of those disciples, because in many ways it is no different than where we find ourselves 2,000 years later. The disciples are sitting in Jerusalem, huddled in fear. They're confused by what is going on. They even ask Jesus, "Is now the time that you're going to restore the kingdom? Will there be an end to this mess, to this Roman occupation, to this fear of the Jews? Is there any way that you can make it go away?" And Jesus' response was, "No, you need to stay indoors. You stay in one place. You remain inside in Jerusalem, and you wait. And you don't return to your job. You don't return to your family. You wait in isolation. And as we read this story, it is here. It is here in that moment of unemployment and isolation and distancing. It's here in the moment of being quarantined inside that house that the Spirit meets the disciples. The Spirit meets us unhindered, even when we are behind closed doors. The Spirit can move through the walls, move through the barriers directly into the heart, to assure us that we are not alone. God does not expect that tomorrow will be a return to normal. We long to get back to whatever normal was for us. But truth be told, that's not going to happen. We may return to a bit of our routine, or maybe return to our job, or maybe venture out of our house, but it will not be normal. And at the time when the Spirit came and rested upon those disciples in that locked room, as they huddled there, when God came and the winds blew and the fire rested upon them, God did not expect a return to normal. But He met them where they were. And He pushed them forward and invited them to change. To be able to venture outside the building in which they found themselves and to speak the gospel. To witness to the love and the power of Jesus Christ in languages and among people they had never known before. Their life would not be normal. It would not be a return to the old job or the old kosher kitchen. They would encounter people of international flavor, from cultures they had never experienced before, and their life would never be the same. They would not venture that way on their own. They probably would not have done it voluntarily had not the Spirit pushed them in that direction. Because you know how it is. Change is hard, and we like the familiar stuff, even when it meets with great resistance. We like to come to church and hear our favorite hymns and sing the stuff we know. The other night I jumped in my wife's car to run a quick errand. I fired up the car and was ready to pull out of the driveway. But before I could leave, I really had to change that radio station. I'm not a big country fan, but there it was, blaring as loud as could be. My wife was tuned into some country western radio station. I was not familiar with that. I didn't care to listen to that, and so I retuned the radio. Just before Christmas, I was in a Walmart and I listened to a supervisor speak to two of her employees because they were from Bosnia and they were speaking to one another in their native language. And the supervisor said, no, we would not do that, apparently, at Walmart. I knew the man who was the store manager of the Quick Check in Washington, and he took to playing Mozart loudly over the outside loudspeakers at the store because it kept the kids from loitering. Because at the end of the day, we like to stick with things that are familiar to us. And when things become unfamiliar, uncertain, we tend to avoid them. But know this on this Pentecost Sunday, that we, the people of God, here in this place at Living Waters, we have an opportunity at this time, while we are as sequestered as those early disciples were, to be open to letting the Holy Spirit rest inside our hearts, to cause us, to prod us, to invite us, to think about how God is challenging us to move forward in new ways. We will never be able to go back to whatever normal was. But we will be called and invited to engage our neighbor, our friends, and even strangers with a witness to Jesus Christ. A witness that will be created and nurtured and commissioned by the coming of the Holy Spirit. So we turn to this story again and again. The story of Jesus Christ and his followers. The story where the Holy Spirit cannot be hindered. For it is pleasing in God's sight that we be filled with that same Spirit and we become his witnesses.